It wasn't you, it was an adaptation that you took on as a way of surviving your childhood, as a way of soothing your pain. It's when we get older that we realize that there's something more to us than a personality, that the personality is actually a defensive cover for who we truly are. And as we start, you go through therapy and you go through layers, and then you realize, oh, that's not actually me, and I'm freer without it. Then you realize that what we thought was the personality was actually just a defensive cover. My next book is going to be entitled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. And when I say insane culture, I mean a culture that doesn't meet human needs. So if you take a condition like high blood pressure, for which, what's the medical term for high blood pressure?
Hypertension.
Hypertension. Okay, and doctors, of course, our colleagues say, well, there's a few types of hypertension for which there's a cause, like kidney disease or some kind of hormonal disorder. Just take the word hypertension and slow it down a bit. Hypertension, hypertension, hypertension. Maybe there's too much tension in people's lives, and if you actually look at the rising rates of hypertension, it's got to do with social pressure and social stresses. And I know that usually when I take care of myself, I have the blood pressure of a young person. But there's been times in my life when I've been driven by stress, and I've had blood pressure ranges in the risky end of the scale. So for me, when my blood pressure goes up, it's a real warning. Buddy, you've got too much tension in your lives. You better do something about it. All we do in medicine is we hand out pills, or we tell people to lose weight, but we never address the sources of real tension in their lives. And so, for example, if you look at black American males, they have much higher risk of hypertension than, say, white American males. What we say is genetic. No, it isn't. Their biological relatives in Africa do not have high blood pressure.
Right.
So it's an artifact of being a black male in essentially a racist society. And James Baldwin, the American writer, once said that being a black American male is to live in a condition of suppressed rage all the time.
Yeah.
Well, that suppressed rage will drive your blood pressure. So high blood pressure is a great example of a socially induced physiological condition, which is mediated through our emotions and the impact of our emotions on our autonomic nervous system and on our hormones. When you get down to it, it's very simple. Either you raise human beings whose needs are met, or you raise human beings in a way that you don't meet their needs. When you don't meet people's needs, they have to adapt in artificial ways. Those adaptations become a source of illness later on. There was an article in Childhood Development generated by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. So as prestigious as you get. And in their abstract, they say that human environments that, because of scarcity or stress, trouble young children, cause these children to make adaptations which are psychological and physiological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a long-term cost to health, behavior, and longevity. In other words, the way that young children adapt to stress early on helps them survive that early stress, but in the long term, those same adaptations become sources of pathology. So if you look at my own tuning out, so the tuning out that I did as an infant under conditions of severe psychological strain is an adaptation. It helped me as an infant survive a year where the situation was utterly impossible. But that same tuning out gets programmed into my brain, and now I'm diagnosed with a medical condition, ADHD, decades later. So what was adaptive in one circumstance becomes maladaptive later on. I'm suggesting that much of illness begins with that these are necessary personally adaptations, however, which then stress us later on. And so that there's a real, so what's common to my work is that I look at the sources of adult function or dysfunction in our formative experiences. And, That's not controversial if you look at a gardener. I mean, if a gardener looks at their plants, they know that how they treat that young plant will have a huge impact on the adult plant. Anybody who is in animal husbandry will realize that how you treat the young, whether it's a dog or a horse, will have a huge impact on the personality and behavior of that animal later on. Why don't we get the same thing in human beings? It's the same principle. So it's essentially very simple. I make the distinction between blame and responsibility. Blame says that you did something that you could have done otherwise, and so therefore you're at fault. That's what blame says. Responsibility says, yes, you did this to yourself, but not consciously or deliberately. You did it because you're programmed to do it by your own childhood experience, which in turn was programmed by your parents' childhood experience. So there's nobody at fault. Everybody does their best. But we do pass these unconscious patterns on. And you don't blame people for having unconscious patterns. You try to make them conscious of it so they can take responsibility for it. So there's no responsibility without consciousness. And there's no blame. So I don't blame anybody for their illness. I don't blame their parents either. But I do say these unconscious patterns, unconscious emotional dynamics have an impact on your physiology. That's all. And if you want to have an impact on your physiology, you got to get conscious. You have to realize what have you been doing unconsciously so you can stop doing it or do it differently. So it's a matter of liberating people from these ingrained patterns for which they're not to be blamed. So in my world, there's no room for blame whatsoever. But there is room for helping people to become responsible, for helping people being response-able, being able to respond to their circumstances. And without awareness, none of us are response-able. The personality itself is a defensive structure that we develop as a way of dealing with our pain. So much of what we consider to be our personality is actually an overlay upon our true selves. And so these weren't choices in childhood. For example, with my ADD, the tuning out. I never chose to tune out, but when I was an infant under the conditions that I've described of being a Jewish infant under the Nazis, I had plenty of stress on me. And how does an infant deal with stress that they can't change? They tune out. And then the tuning out becomes programmed into my brain. And then so many years later, I'm diagnosed with ADD. It wasn't a choice that I made, it was an adaptation. So what I would say about the personality, it wasn't you, it was an adaptation that you took on as a way of surviving your childhood, as a way of soothing your pain. It's when we got older that we realized that there's something more to us than a personality, that the personality is actually a defensive cover for who we truly are. And as we start, you go through therapy and you go through layers and then you realize, oh, that's not actually me. And I'm freer without it. Then you realize that what we thought was the personality was actually just a defensive cover. And once we strip that defense off and we find it no longer necessary, we become much more true to ourselves, much more true to ourselves, so we become much more balanced and happier in our lives. So yes, it was the personality, but you are not your personality. When I speak to a room of people and I ask them how many are addicted, most people will only think of drugs, so some people put their hand up. Then I give them my broader definition of addiction, and not everybody puts their hand up. And that definition is that an addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences in the long term, and is going to be able to give it up. So any behavior, not just drugs. The key hallmarks are craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, negative outcomes in the long term, inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. Sex, to gambling, to shopping, to eating, to work, to exercise, to the internet, to gaming, to pornography, to political power, to the acquisition of wealth, to the hoarding of objects, anything. And when you give that definition, and you ask people how many here would acknowledge some addiction in their life, sometimes the vast majority of people would put their hands up, which means to say that addictions are on a continuum, it's on a spectrum, and they're distributed, dispersed throughout all of our society, and so that the identified drug addicts make up only a small, narrow segment of our addicted population. Really what it is, all addictions are an attempt to regulate an unbearable emotional state internally. But you're trying to regulate your internal state through external means, and that's what an addiction is. So temporarily you get a change in the state of your brain, in a change of your physiology. You can do that through drugs. You can also do it through gambling or internet or sex or shopping. But essentially after that same revitalization of your incentive and motivation circuitry of your brain. And so from my perspective, there's only one universal addiction process that dominates all addicted people. The targets of addiction may be different. The internal effects are much the same. When you look at the sources of it, the states that people are trying to escape are states of emotional distress, states of emotional pain, and hence why the addiction, not why the addiction, but why the pain.
As we end this video with Dr. Gabor Mate, we're reminded of the transformative power of self-awareness and understanding. Let us carry forward the insights gained today, embracing our true selves beyond the confines of personality and nurturing compassion for ourselves and others. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening journey. Until next time, may you continue to uncover the depths of your authenticity and find peace in your path of self-discovery.